When you've got some model classes defined and you've got some views and controllers using that model, you're in pretty good shape. You've got a nice, loosely coupled way of dealing with data and getting it to your views. But there's still this outstanding question of how does data actually get into your model? Or in other words, if I have classes that define my entities, they define what my data looks like, how do I actually get data in there from, say, database tables or files? Well, one way you can get data into your model is with hard-coded collections. You don't actually need a database in your MVC applications or in any application for that matter. So when you're designing an application, one thing you might ask yourself is whether or not a hard-coded collection is an appropriate way to get data into your model. I once developed a very extensive tool for Microsoft that used no database tables whatsoever. It was all just hard-coded collections. That doesn't happen very often, but in this case they solved the problem very well. So that's one of the ways you can get data into your model. You can also get data from databases, which is probably by far and away the most common way MVC applications deal with data. And a lot of times when people work with databases, they will also use an object relational map or an ORM. This is a special framework whose mission in life is to map between your domain classes, your models, and your database tables. So this way your models can look nice and object-oriented, and your database tables can be optimized for relational storage or document storage if you're using a NoSQL database. And the ORM sits in between and maps back and forth between these guys. And there's lots of them out there. Entity Framework is Microsoft's, and it's very well known. There's also NHibernate, which is also very popular, but there's plenty of others. Open Access, Ibotis, there's plenty of ORMs out there to choose from. Or you might choose not to use one at all, but databases are a very popular and common way to get data into the model. Classes that are mapped from other classes, and this arises in all kinds of ways. For example, you may have domain classes that incorporate other domain classes. They might be collections, larger aggregates or groups of other domain classes, so they really get their data from other classes. Or they might even represent a smaller piece of another domain class. You might have view models that get mapped from your model classes. So if you've got a view and it's bound to a view model, your view model might pull together several model classes or subsets of those model classes. And so you need to map back and forth between those, but that's where your data is actually going to come from. And then there's DTO, or data transfer objects, and these come into play in two situations. One is if you are sending data over a network, like through web services or the web API. A lot of times you don't want to transfer a whole domain object with all of its bits and pieces and collections and children and what have you. And so what people do is they make a smaller class called a DTO, which just has bits and pieces of a domain object, and that's what gets sent over a network. Well, even if you're not using web services or sending the data over the network, DTOs can still be very handy, because a lot of times you don't need to display or work with all possible data that might be associated with a model class. You just might want to work, say, with first name and last name and an ID, and not necessarily the address and the phone number and the order history and all the other things that might be associated with a class like that. One ORM that is very popular, and it is Microsoft's, is Entity Framework. And the reason that we mention it here is because Entity Framework is actually built into the MVC scaffolding process. Now, I want to make it very clear that you do not have to use Entity Framework with MVC4. You can use any ORM that you want. You can use no ORM whatsoever and just write your own data access code. You don't even need to use a database. But the reason I bring this up is because Entity Framework is built into the MVC4 scaffolding process. So when you're making your scaffolds for your controllers and views, there's some options for Entity Framework that if that's what you're using, it can write a whole lot more code for you and get you up and running even faster. Entity Framework is also handy because it can generate your database directly from the classes you design. We call this the code-first approach. It's my favorite approach because then I can design my model in a nice object-oriented way, and then I can just tell Entity Framework, pick a good database structure and generate the database. You can also go the other way around and generate your model classes from a database. I don't necessarily like to go this way myself because the way you design a database is not always the way you want to design a good object-oriented model. But this can be very handy if, for instance, you already have a database and you want to get a web application up and running pretty quickly. You can just generate your models from the database, and then if you need to tweak those classes, you can. You can also split the difference and make a high-level model diagram called an EDMX diagram and generate your model classes in your database from this sort of model diagram that you create. So however it is you like to work, Entity Framework can generally help you out getting your model designed and get it talking to your data. And once you've got that entity relationship defined with Entity Framework, MVC4 can use that and automatically generate a lot of code for you. I'm looking at a project that was built using MVC4 and using the Internet Application template. And if you've ever used that template before, you know it creates a lot of pre-existing stuff for you, and that's why I've got this account models class and a home controller and home views, and I've also added a few other things in here. Model classes. I've got an author, which is the author ID and a name. I've got a genre, which is a genre ID and a name, and also a list of the books that's in that genre. And then I've got the actual book class itself, which is book ID, genre ID, author ID, title, price, but also the genre and the author. Now I'm going to get rid of this just for a second because I don't want it to confuse anything we're going to do here with a new data context. So I've got this book class, I've got my author class, I've got my genre class, and what I want to do is get data into these models, and I'm going to use Entity Framework to do it. Now I want to make clear once more that I do not have to use Entity Framework in MVC4. I can use another ORM, I can use no database at all, I can use data access code that I write myself. However, Entity Framework is built into the MVC4 scaffolding platform, so there's a lot of automated features if we decide to go that way. So for this demonstration, that's the way I'm going to go. I'm going to use Entity Framework and show you how easy it can be to get up and running with a database going that route and using the scaffolding, and then we can get data into and out of our models. So I've got my models. What I'm going to do is go to controllers, and I'm going to add a controller. And I'm going to call this the Store Manager controller. Now, normally I would not make a controller that was responsible for managing lots and lots of things. Usually you want one controller to be responsible for one kind of entity or one kind of thing. But just to kind of pull some of this together and for simplicity's sake, I'm going to make a Store Manager controller. And you'll notice I have various templates I can use. I can use it with empty read-write actions, which is really the most common thing I choose. And that way I can fill in those read-write actions with whatever code I want. But since I'm going to use Entity Framework this time around, I'm just going to select this. And then for my model class, I'm going to select book. Now here, you heard me mention data context earlier. A data context is what Entity Framework uses to ship data back and forth between your models and your database. So think of the data context kind of like a bucket that carries water, except it's a bucket that carries data. So when you need to load up your model classes with data, that data context is going to carry data from the database to your model classes. And as you make changes or add new ones or whatnot, when you want to save those changes back to the database, the data context is going to be a bucket that carries those changes back to the database. Well, we don't have a data context yet because we haven't created one. So this, if I had data context, they would show up here in my list. But in this case, I'm going to create a new data context. and it pops up with new data context. All I need to do is decide on a name. And this actually looks pretty good. Sometimes people will put in DB context to remind them that it's a database, or you know, some other kind of naming convention so that you know where this data is coming from. If it's coming from a mainframe, you might put that in there. I'm just going to leave it the way it is. And when I hit add, it's going to write a lot of code for me. Okay. So you'll notice that I got the Store Manager Controller class, and it sets up a bookstore context. Okay, remember this is my bucket, so everywhere you see this DB, that's going to be my bucket. And you can see it created a controller with an index method to include the genre when I load the books and include the author. The details for an individual book, it's going to find it by ID. Here's the code to create a new book. And here's when you post the values back. Notice it puts it into the data context, saves the changes, repopulates select lists with genres and authors. So you see, it just writes a ton of code for me. And then if I want to go in and modify this, I of course can, but it writes tons and tons of boilerplate code to work with Entity Framework. Okay, so that's the controller, and it does the delete, it does a confirmation, you know, just about anything you might want. If we take a look at these views, you'll notice it created a ton of views for me, and these views are already wired up. So here we've got the index page, and here it's going to display a list of books, and it's going to display the properties, and it creates hyperlinks to edit and delete the books. If I go over here to details, this is the details for a specific book. Create form, edit form, delete form. You know, now of course you're going to want to customize all this, but it's a great starting point. I mean, already I can go ahead and start adding and editing and deleting books. Now I do want to draw your attention to this guy, the bookstore context. This is something that was created by the MVC class. It says you can add custom code to this file. Changes will not be overwritten. And here it created a database set of books, a DB set of genres, and a DB set of authors. These are all Entity Framework specific things. So this is my bucket that holds my collections of books and genres and authors, and any changes I make to these buckets are going to be saved back to the database. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and build this. Okay, so now if I actually try to run this, okay, so I get my default page, and these views that they created are all in the Store Manager directory, because that's what I put into the scaffolding. All right, so if I come back here, and I go to say Store Manager, and I pull up the index, I get my index page. Now there's nothing here because I don't have any books yet, but I can add one right from this page. I just go to Create New. Okay, I've got no genres and I've got no authors, but I could put in a title. I could add in a price. Oh, it's not going to let me. See, the genre ID field is required and the author ID field is required. This is all code that it generated for me. Okay, so in order to put in genres and authors, I need, well, genres and authors. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back here and we'll get up and running in no time. I'm going to delete the little author view I have right now, and I'm going to let the scaffolding do it for me. And I'm going to delete the little author controller here, so I can let the scaffolding do that for me. Okay, so what I'm going to do is do what I did before. I'm going to come here to add controller. I'm going to add a controller for our authors. I'm going to use Entity Framework. The model class is going to be author. And here's my data context. I don't need to do anything for that. And right away it creates add, edit, and delete pages for authors, and it creates a controller that'll do it. If I come down here to views, you'll notice I've got author, create, delete, details, edit, index. That's pretty slick, huh? And I can do the same thing for genres. Genre controller, model class, genre, data context, that looks fine. Okay, and it does the same thing. Let's make sure we build. All the code it generated was good. It's always a good sign. Okay, so this time I'm going to add an author. There's my index for author. I'm going to hit create new. What do I want the name to be? Let's use this guy. And now I have an author in my authors list, and I can edit him. I can see his details. I can delete him. Okay, so that all looks all right. How about genre? I'm going to come up here and go to genre. Got no genres yet. Create a new one. What's the name of this genre? Let's go with sci-fi. Okay, and obviously I can create other genres as I see fit. You know, it's just adding them to the list. All code that was generated for me. Alright, so now let's get back to Store Manager and start making some books. So here in my drop down is going to be a sci-fi book. I wrote it. And the title is going to be, let's see, A Mind Forever Demoing. It's kind of got a sci-fi ring to it for $9.99. Great, there's my book. Okay. I can look at the book's details. I can edit this book. Okay. And I can delete this book. It asks me, are you sure you want to delete this? Sure. And now I've got no book in my list. Now, you might be asking yourself, how did this happen when I didn't set up a database or anything? Well, here's the interesting thing. Visual Studio, when you install it, installs an instance of SQL Server Express, and right now the Entity Framework automatically created that database for me in SQL Server Express. So I can even export that database if I wanted to, and that's a little outside of the scope of what we're doing here, but as you can see, scaffolding plus Entity Framework can get you up and running extremely quickly.